My name is Joseph Beige. I'm a real estate attorney on Long Island, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program. For our returning viewers, as always, I'd like to thank you for your support, your continued positive comments, and your suggestions for future episodes. If you're a new viewer, let me explain what we do. With the help of a guest, I'm going to discuss a topic that's related to real estate. The hope is that it will help you, the Long Island real estate consumer, make a better, more informed decision on your next real estate transaction. As always, if you enjoy these programs, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel. It would be very appreciated. Now, today we're going to be talking about a scenario that affects a lot of Long Islanders. Believe it or not, as bad as the housing crunch is on Long Island, which is all over the news, low inventories for homes that are available, many Long Islanders do find themselves owning multiple properties. Sometimes it's because they're actually in the business of investing in real estate and becoming landlords. Other times it's because they may have inherited one and decided to hold on to the property as an investment and rent it out to a family member or relative. Other times that the real estate is owned as part of a business, and that's what the business owner is looking at as part of their retirement package. These people, when they own multiple homes, find themselves dealing with capital gains, investment income, things of that nature. And one of the tricks or one of the available mechanisms for them to help eliminate capital gains or soften it is a 1031 exchange. Speaking and helping me today to understand the 1031 exchange, which admittedly I don't understand very well, is Todd Pajonas of 1031 Exchange Services, Inc. Todd, thank you for being here, and I apologize for butchering your last name.
No, you said it. You said it correct. Thanks for having me here.
Well, close enough for rock.
Close enough.
Right? Okay, Todd. First off, what is a 1031 exchange in general? Because
sure.
It's something that a lot of people don't know outside of the real estate or accounting profession.
Sure, absolutely. 1031 exchange is a means of deferring capital gains tax when you sell business or investment property. So it's surely not going to be used for, say, your primary residence or vacation home, properties that you use personally, but anything else, rental home, strip mall, investment properties, business properties. When you sell that, you would have a capital gain. A 1031 exchange is used to defer that.
Okay. Now, again, capital gains is something that really is an accounting issue, but as a quick one-sentence overview for clients or viewers who may not be familiar with that term, what is a capital gains?
So capital gain is the tax that you owe when you sell an investment property, something that you've held for over a year. And the way to figure out a capital gain when you're selling a piece of investment property is you'll take your sale price, you'll subtract out the adjusted basis. Adjusted basis, that sounds like a scary term. It's really what you bought it for many years ago, minus all the depreciation you've taken, plus capital improvements. You also subtract out your expenses of sale, and that'll give you a gain, because it's a big misnomer. Sometimes people think I sell, I pay off my mortgage, what's left over is the money I made. That's just net cash. That's not capital gain.
Okay. Now let's double back a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background in the industry and how you got involved in doing 1031 exchanges.
Sure. So I'm an attorney. I've kind of always been involved in real estate. I started out in the title insurance industry in the legal department, and just working late one night, this very well-known title insurance attorney named Joe Friedman said, do you want to be in charge of 1031? And I said, what's that? And so I didn't know. And that's about 25 years ago. So then I got put in charge at a large title company, and really the rest has just been history. It's been 25 years of helping people and companies structure 1031 exchanges.
Now let's talk about Legal 1031 Exchange Services, because that's actually the company. And for 1031 exchanges, as we'll get to later, you actually do need an intermediary. So tell us a little bit about Legal 1031 Exchange Services.
Sure. So we're a qualified intermediary, and we do have our processing office here on Long Island in Woodbury. And all we do is structure 1031 exchanges. And you're right. If you just sell and take your money and use that money to buy another property, what you have is a taxable sale and a purchase with after-tax dollars. You always need to involve a qualified intermediary, and you have to engage them before you actually sell the property.
Thank you. Now, I know we already hit on briefly what a 1031 is, what a capital gains, and so forth. So let's start back now and get into a little more detail. What is exactly a 1031 exchange? Let's put a little more meat on that.
So The way I like to describe a 1031 exchange is it is a sale, just like any other sale, and a purchase, just like any other purchase. I mentioned that I'm an attorney, but say you're representing someone structuring a 1031 exchange. I don't replace you. The bottom line is when you act as a qualified intermediary, that's the only thing that you can do. And also, we have to be an independent party to the transaction. So when you're selling, an attorney, the accountant, the realtor, all the people that are involved in it, they're not allowed to act as a qualified intermediary. And as an attorney, and my partner, Matt Sheriff, is a CPA, he's not allowed to act in the traditional role as a CPA. So we're an add-on to the transaction. When you sell, you're going to have your broker, you're going to have the CPA giving tax advice, you're going to have the attorney, such as yourself, representing the client. We're an add-on. We're going to prepare the paperwork necessary to structure the 1031 exchange, and then later on, we're going to collect that money at the closing, use that to buy another property that the client picks out. And again, there's going to be a broker and an attorney such as yourself representing them.
Qualified intermediary. What is that?
So a qualified intermediary is the fancy technical, and you could say a term that's in the code for an entity that acts as the qualified intermediary. And again, that's just fancy language to say the independent third party that's going to prepare the necessary paperwork and act as the independent third party to hold the net proceeds. Those are really we have three jobs. Hold the net proceeds from the closing. The client or their attorney is not allowed to receive those funds. Prepare the necessary paperwork to structure it as a 1031 exchange. And the third thing that we like to say is we're not permitted by law to give tax or legal advice, but we can give information. We can answer questions. So we like to say that we hold our clients' hands through the transaction. That's the third thing that we do.
Look, for a 1031 exchange, what are the steps involved?
So again, it starts off just like any other transaction. You make a decision to sell, you probably list it with a broker, you get an accepted offer, you hire an attorney who negotiates a contract, and then you're ready to close. It's at that point that you hire a qualified intermediary. Maybe you want to get us involved beforehand because maybe you have some questions about the process. It's never too early. It can be too late, right? So if you call us at the closing table, I don't recommend this. It's not too late. We can, quickly pump out some documents and usually make it happen. What I always like to say is you call us from the closing table, we can maybe make it happen. Call us from the parking lot after the closing, it's too late. Once you close, it's too late. So you have to hire the qualified intermediary before you close.
Are there any requirements for that 1031 exchange?
Sure. So in addition to hiring a qualified intermediary and having us hold the net proceeds, one of the big and often talked about requirements of the other timelines of a 1031 exchange. There's a finite amount of time you have to complete the exchange. So from when you sell your property, and when I mean sell, I don't mean entering into contract, I mean go to the closing, deed goes across the table, money comes back. From that closing date, you have 180 days in which to complete the exchange. And within that 180 days, the first 45 days is what's called the identification period. You have to provide us with a list of potential properties that you may want to buy. So that many times is the real stress for a taxpayer to complete an exchange, is to figure out what they may want to buy and provide us with that list.
Now, I realize for clients that are moving out of state, other states' real estate transactions move at lightning speed compared to New York. But if it was a 1031 being done in New York, 180 days it's tight. I mean, you can be looking at 60 days, 70 days right off the bat from the time you're in contract if there's a mortgage involved just to get a closing. Is that 180 days in any way extendable?
It's not unless there's a federally declared disaster. So it is a hard stop. And not only is it 180 days, it's 180 calendar days. So when it falls on a weekend or a holiday, it does not roll over like most tax deadlines do into another day. But what I have to tell you is, even though a lot of people think that the 180 days is very short, on average, most people complete their exchange in about 90 days. Okay. So most people don't even bump up against it. It's very rare for somebody to go all the way out there, as long as everybody's focused and they have a good attorney.
Okay. Well, having a good attorney is always the key.
That's right.
What about the property itself? Are there any requirements of the property, any types of property that are excluded from 1031 exchanges?
Sure. So firstly, you can only exchange domestic property to domestic property. So it's the United States. Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands under certain circumstances. Puerto Rico is not included in that, so it has to be domestic. And the second requirement is that the property has to be like kind, which confuses a lot of people. The term sounds like, oh, I'm selling a multifamily. Like kind would mean that I have to buy a multifamily, but actually, like kind means that it's held for business or investment purposes. So you can go from a strip mall to a two-family rental home, to an industrial property, to vacant land, to commercial property, to multifamily. They're all considered like kind to each other.
When we say investment property, what are the requirements to make it an investment property for 1031 exchange purposes?
So you can really look at, I found the best way to explain it is looking at property three different ways. Business property. So in 1031, they say it should be held for productive use in a trade or business or for investment purposes. That's the technical term. So held for productive use in a trade or business. What that really means is you have located your business within the real estate, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a law firm in a building or a house that you use for, whether it's a car wash, whether you're a manufacturer, regardless, your business is located in there. That's what held for productive use in a trade or business means. Held for investment is more common what we think of as a landlord-tenant relationship. You've bought the property as an investment, whether it's multifamily, commercial, mixed use. You own the property, but you have tenants in there, right? So that's investment. And the last thing, which is also wrapped up into investment, is you could buy a piece of vacant land or a burned out building thinking one day this is going to be worth a lot of money. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be income producing. It just has to be something that you feel is going to be an investment someday.
Clearly, the burnt out building or the vacant land, you can't put a person, you can't put a tenant in. And obviously, on the other side, you have that, let's say, we'll call it a single family condo that you buy in Florida and you're renting it out as a landlord, that clearly falls in. But I just want to make clear, or ask the question, I should say, if let's say I buy that single family condo in Florida, I don't put a tenant in there, but I say it's for investment because I expect it to go up in value over the next 5 or 10 years. Is that going to qualify as a 1031, or is that getting a little too cute for my own good?
So the funny thing is the IRS actually cracked down on that area about 15 years ago. Years ago, believe it or not, I used to do like these little seminars, not unlike this podcast, out on the east end of Long Island in the Hamptons, and say, you own a vacation home. Hey, I'm going to teach you how to do a 1031 exchange, because back then, if you said it was an investment, it was an investment. About 15 years ago, the IRS cracked down on that, and they established a separate class of property, if you want to call it, called dwelling units. And think of it as any place that you could live, a house or a condo. And they said that if you use 1031 money to buy it, that you have to show at least 2 weeks worth of rental income each year for a 2-year period, and also restrict your personal use to 2 weeks or 10% of the time that you rent it out. So what they're trying to do is make sure that it's a true investment property and that you're not necessarily using it for your own personal use. Okay.
And not to belabor the point, but saying for 2 weeks, so if you buy that in property and you say it's an investment, I'm going to put it on Airbnb, for example, as long you can do that. You don't have to have it rented out 365 days out of the year, but your use is restricted to 10% of the amount of time that you're renting it out on as an Airbnb, for example, right? Short-term rental.
For the first 2 years. After that, it's whatever you want. So that's a nice thing.
When we talk about commercial properties or residential properties, are they treated the same for 1031 as long as they meet that scenario?
Absolutely. They're all considered like kind. Commercial, residential, industrial, vacant land, they're all going to be, even there can either, goes really beyond this, but air rights, say in New York, are considered a real property interest. We've had people sell air rights, transferable development rights is what they're technically called, but sell air rights and use that money to buy a strip mall. So even something that's not even tangible yet can be sold as a 1031 exchange.
Now, what about commingling property? So let's say I have a property that's pure commercial. It's a strip mall. It's where I have my gas station, something of that nature in New York. And I want to do a 1031 and pick up a condo or some kind of property that's, let's say out of state, Florida, the Carolinas. Am I allowed to commingle those properties?
So you can absolutely go from one type of property to another. So you could sell that gas station and buy a condo outside of New York, and as long as it's held for business or investment purposes, that's going to be quite all right.
So really, that's it. The property becomes less of an issue. The bigger issue is what you defined before, which is that we have to hold it for an investment, commercial purpose, or what have you. And if it's going to be residential, you think that first 2 years you have the restrictions.
Right. Okay. That's really the only one that has a restriction on it. Is a residential. Nobody's sleeping in a gas station, so the IRS didn't feel the need to put any restriction. It's just these houses and condos and co-ops.
Because I have a client who actually did this. They liquidated their holdings up here, and they had bought property for residential down in the Carolinas, and we're actually going to start putting cabins up. But they had also kicked around the idea of turning it into a mobile park or an RV home. How would that fall under a 1031?
Believe it or not, we've had a lot of mobile home exchanges. And the only issue that occurs with a mobile home is that the mobile homes themselves, by their very definition, are not structures, even though a lot of times there's wheels taken off and things like that. So if something isn't permanently fixed to the land, the value of those improvements, if you will, they're not technically real property improvements, but what's placed on there is not going to be included in the value if you sell it. So if you have a mobile home park, the value of those mobile homes themselves, which many times are tenants and the owner doesn't own it anyway, the real value is the infrastructure of the mobile home park, the hookups, the electricity, excluding the business value. That can all be exchanged in a 1031 exchange.
I want to run a couple of scenarios. Sure. I think sometimes maybe running through a real world scenario because I'm sure 1031s sound good to a lot of people. They're listening to this and saying, hey, that's great. You mean I'm not going to get hammered on my capital gains when I sell my business that I bought 30 or 40 years ago, that property. So let's run through one. We have a typical homeowner, typical Long Islander. They own their house, which as a primary is going to be exempt primarily, or most of it will be exempt. But they have this business property, and they're now going to sell it, and they're going to take a hit on the capital gains. There's not much they can do there unless they use a 1031. Let's run through a scenario where they're retiring, but they're not really selling their primary house yet in New York, but they do want to get their retirement home out of state. How would that look? As
we've been discussing, if you use 1031 money to buy a dwelling unit, a house, a condo, a co-op, you can't use it. There are restrictions for the first 2 years, but after that, it's in the rules. This is not a gray area. If you've satisfied those rules of renting it out 2 weeks each year for a 2-year period and restricting your personal use, that can become your primary residence later on. So it's a typical scenario where somebody, say from New York, will first sell their investment property, and they'll buy that house, condo, or co-op down in Carolinas, Florida, wherever. And they rent it out for 2 years, and in the meantime, maybe they're the last 2 years of their job, and they finish up. Then when they sell their primary residence up here, they get the primary residence capital gains tax exclusion, $250 if you're single, $500,000 exclusion if you're married under Section 121. They take that money, they can stick it in their pocket, maybe it funds their retirement, and then they move into that house, condo, co-op that they bought with 1031 money. It's like having a 35% off coupon when they buy that price through a 1031 exchange.
Okay, and as we said, they identify the property within 45 prior to the closing. And I know because again with my clients, you guys have advised me this too. Keep you guys in the loop. But once we know we have a closing date on the horizon, now we'll start getting all the pieces in place for a 1031. You have your closing. That starts the 45 days to identify a property.
That's right.
Now, we didn't really define it, but when you say identify a property, what do you have to do? Is it just saying this is a property? Do you have to actually be in formal contract?
No, it's a really good question. One of the forms that, as the qualified intermediary, we prepare for our clients is the identification of replacement property form. And all it means is that you have to put down an address on this form. In some cases, a value. There's various rules that would probably take up a good portion of this podcast if we went through it. Let's just say that you can't just take a phone book of Myrtle Beach and say these are some of the properties we're thinking about. There are some restrictions on the number of properties that you have to identify, but really what you're putting down is just the address. If it's a condo or co-op, you're putting the unit number down, and you have to return that form to the qualified intermediary by midnight of the 45th day from when you closed.
Now, I got a follow-up question because you hit on something that I don't think I necessarily realized myself. Multiple properties can be identified in that 45-day window, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's say I'm looking at a condo complex, and I say, okay, there's 4 units for sale. I'm negotiating. I don't know which one I'm going to end up with. I identify all 4, and that's permissible. What happens if all 4 of those deals fall through, but a 5th one appears?
If you're before the 45th day, you can amend your identification. If you're after the 45th day and you can't buy any of the properties that you identified, you're probably getting out your checkbook at that point to write a check. The only thing, and it's kind of bad karma, you don't want to hope for it, but if there's a federally declared disaster, think hurricane, fire, flood, things like that, and it materially affects the property that you're looking to purchase, one of them, maybe that's the reason why you can't close on it, then you get another bite at the apple.
Okay.
But if, barring that happening, if you can't buy what you identified, you're paying the tax.
Okay. So the prudent purchaser who's doing a 1031, if they're looking in Florida, well, again, they don't want to take out the phone book for Myrtle Beach or for Fort Lauderdale or what have you, but if the broker says, I'm showing you 5 or 6 condos, list them all. Don't, just be on the safe side. And there's no geographic limit, correct, as well, right? So anything that as you said earlier, as long as it's the United States, Guam, Puerto Rico, you said the limit didn't count. So
yeah. Absolutely. Anywhere. And, a lot of the money does flow. It tends to flow from the Northeast, South, and from California. It kind of flows to the southwestern portion of the United States, a lot in Arizona and Texas and places like that, especially places like Texas and Florida are real hot spots for 1031 investment because, and Nevada included, they have no state income tax. So if you exchange your property down to Florida and move down to Florida, you've relieved yourself of 8.82% in New York tax.
Right. Let's say we have somebody who's been an active investor in Long Island real estate. They have 2 or 3 investment homes or properties, I should say. Now they can combine all 3, and let's say they're liquidating them. Again, they all have to still fall under the 45 and the 180. To qualify as a 1031. But can you take multiple properties and then knock it down to, let's say go from 3 investment properties in New York to 1 property in another state, and vice versa? Can you go from owning 1 big property and then own 3 smaller properties?
Sure. We see both ends of the spectrum. We see consolidation and diversification. I actually had clients many years ago when I was first starting out, 20 plus years ago. This 3 brothers, they owned over 100 single and 2-family homes on Long Island. So this is going back in the early 2000s, and they managed everything themselves. And they were in a good sweet spot. It was a good housing market at that point. What they did was they would put 10 up for sale. They would sell all 10, combine that money, and buy 1 apartment building. Sell another 10, buy 1 strip mall. Instead of 10 roofs, 10 boilers, 10 toilet bowls, 10 locations, then it was 1 strip mall, 1 house, and it became a lot easier for them to manage. So that's you can consolidate. The trick, though, is the timing. When you want to pool money together from many sales, it's the closing of the first one that starts all the time deadlines running. So you have to kind of line them all up and make sure they close 1, 2, 3 like that. The other side of it is sometimes when people taxpayers sell very large assets, $10, $20 million, they don't want to buy just 1 more investment again. They'll sell for $20 million and they'll buy 4 or 5 investment properties for $4 or $5 million each, totaling that $20 million.
Because this is not uncommon when you have somebody who has an investment property, whether it's a single-family house that they're renting out or a two-family or business, that from a tax standpoint, their accountants may depreciate that asset over the life of, does the way they treated it with for tax purposes with depreciation have any effect on a 1031 exchange?
It does. It's another reason to exchange. When we talk about gain really comes about in a couple of different forms. One is capital gain is the rise in value of the property. You buy a property for $500,000, it becomes $1.5 million 20 years later, right? So that's that $1 million that it went up. That's the capital gain. At the same time, the government gives taxpayers who own business or investment properties a benefit called depreciation. While you own the property, each year there's a certain value of it that you exclude from your rental income. It's a deduction that makes your taxable income less. It's a positive while you own the property. But the net effect is every year that you take that deduction, it lowers your basis. And that means that when you go to sell the property, the amount of depreciation you take, you pay a 25% federal tax on that. We refer to it as depreciation recapture. So you can have a situation, odd, and hope this never happens to someone, where they own a property for 10 years and it never goes up in value. But if they've been depreciating it year after year for 10 years, their basis goes down. They still have a gain, even though it hasn't gone up in value. For most taxpayers, it goes up in value and also depreciates, creating this gap, and that's the taxable gap. So depreciation is just one more reason why people need to do 1031 exchanges.
Interesting. Okay, so basically, if you're out there and you have an investment property in any way that your accountant has been depreciating, you definitely want to make sure you're doing a 1031. Otherwise, you're essentially going to get double tapped. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit because this is one when it comes to 1031s that even attorneys don't realize or think about. I remember being at a seminar, I believe you taught years ago, and I kind of took notes. I was like, I never heard of this. A 1031 exchange can actually be used as part of an estate planning process to defer capital gains. And I was wondering if you can take a few moments just to explain that, because that also hits on people potentially who don't even own investment property. I mean, basically anybody who owns a house.
Yeah, it's a good tool for real estate investors. I'll give you a scenario that comes up that answers your question a lot. You'll have someone who owns an apartment building. They bought it when they're younger. Now, depending on what you consider older, and as I get older, that number is growing. Let's say they're well into their 80s now. Multifamily takes effort to own, right? There's a lot that goes into it. They're like, I don't want to do this anymore. But they've owned this property maybe for 30, 40 years. Huge gain. And at this point, they're thinking about estate planning. If they were to sell it in their 80s, they're going to pay a huge tax bill. But maybe they do a 1031 exchange into something that is professionally managed, something like a triple net lease property where the tenant manages all the requirements of the property and you just collect the rent. So it's got zero management. They defer the tax into this kind of property that has no management. And the reason how that factors into 1031 is somebody who can't work with the property anymore, or just doesn't, would recognize that tax when they're in the later years of their life and they're thinking about estate planning. When they finally pass away and they own this property, their heirs will get what's called the stepped up basis. So the basis in that property will become market value on the date of their death. So to bring the example on home, if I'm in my 80s, I'm fortunate enough to make it that far, and I've owned a property for 40 years. If I sell it the day before I die, I'll have a huge tax bill. But if I leave that property to my wife and daughter, they can sell it the next day. And because of the stepped up basis, there should be no tax consequence. There are limitations on what's allowed, but it's a very large number. So for most small investors, they're not going to bounce up against that ceiling.
Somebody who's got that investment property, and they are getting older. They're looking at saying, gee, I want to maybe get rid of a property, because it's getting hard to manage. They're looking at a tax hit. Speak to your accountant, speak to your attorney, because the 1031 exchange may be valuable there as part of your estate planning too. Essentially, I remember the way you said it at the seminar years ago was you're kicking the can down the road on the capital gains, and not to be crass, but you kick it down far enough and then you pass away, it goes away.
Yeah, the phrase that we use, half joking, is swap until you drop. Keep exchanging, and then one day you leave it to your heirs. And actually that kind of like brings it on home is 1031 is a deferral, and the most common question is, when do you have to pay it? With proper estate planning, the answer is perhaps never.
Never. One quick last question. With the 1031, if the property that I'm purchasing or that the client is purchasing, is less than what they sold it for, because we've talked about what is a like-kind property, but let's say the value of the new property is less and there's money left in your account as the intermediary. I'm assuming that just gets released to the client and they pay the tax on it, but I want to be clear that is that what happens?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because there are a lot of these misunderstandings that prevent clients from doing 1031 exchange. And one is because when you hear about 1031, the phrase is you always have to buy for equal or greater to the value of what you sold for. So people think it's an all or nothing game. I could sell for $1 million and buy for only $900,000, pocket the remaining $100,000. Yes, you're absolutely right. I'll pay the tax on the difference, but you can always go down in value. You'll only pay tax on the difference. That's a partial 1031 exchange.
Todd, I appreciate you being here. I got probably 20 more questions that I can ask as an attorney. I'm thinking about all the different scenarios that my clients have and that we can use. Todd, I want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For everybody, as always, you're going to see Todd's contact information after this video is done. If you have any questions regarding a 1031, hopefully we shed some light on it and enlightened you. I know I got much smarter and learned a lot today as well. 1031s, many people tend to think that they're only for high-end big companies, for the very rich. They're underutilized substantially by regular people and can be a huge asset, a huge value to your planning for taxes and even for estate planning, as we just discussed. As always, my name is Joseph Beige. I'm a Long Island real estate attorney. I hope you liked today's program, found it informative. If you do, again, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and as always, I'd love to hear your comments and suggestions for future programs. Todd, again, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.